Hello and welcome to Pedagodzilla, the Pedagogic Podcast with the pop culture core. Today I'm answering the really silly question: how can Playful Pedagogic Podcasting power up education professionals? Anyway, answering that, hello, I am Mike Collins. I am a senior learning designer at the Open University, imposter syndrome incarnate, a man with a tent bag full of slightly battered microphones. And that's how I usually start the episodes of my podcast, with that kind of like, hello, level of energy. I'm also usually joined by my very capable co-host, Mark Childs, who's pictured on the right there. My partner in crime for this. And yeah, I'd just like to really thank Anshul for inviting me along today, and Barbara and Karen as well for your really, really thought-provoking, inspirational talks so far on conversation and relationships and how they can help us reflect and actually kind of keep our practice anchored to itself and to reality. And that, yeah, just the really inspirational thing of utilizing strength to promote learning. I hope you might actually see some elements of that in what I'm going to talk about today, which is the Pedagodzilla Podcast. So I'll be going through what it is, how it works, why it started, how it's evolved, what we and I personally have gained from it, both in terms of professional development, what I've learned about student activities, student creative and collaborative activities from it. I'll then wrap up with some top tips about professional development and how you could use these for students, and then finish with a call to action. So yeah, what is it? Well, it's a podcast. We've been going for around 4 or maybe 5 years at this point, publishing monthly, sometimes bi-weekly. And what we do is we try and understand pedagogy. We try and understand different pedagogic theories, aspects of practice, and we do that through the lens of pop culture to form Funderstanding, which is a terrible, terrible pun, which I was very proud of when I wrote it, and actually now, having come off the back of those really quite wonderful and articulate talks, I'm feeling quite silly about, but let's press on. So we start every episode with an absurd question. They're generally structured around absurd question that smashes pedagogy into pop culture. I've got some examples here. How does Julie Andrews escape Nazis using active learning? How does Arnie keep his skin attached using situated learning in Predator? How does metacognition enable people to be the heroes in their own dystopian LARPs, to name but a few? The way that it's structured is that we start by working out what it is we want to know about. So what is the actual pedagogy that we're interested in finding out about? And I'll get into why we're looking at pedagogies in this way in a moment, but we start off with perhaps identifying a theory. Maybe it's come up in a conversation that we've had, or we've stumbled across it in another episode or a separate piece of research. We then talk about the key characteristics of it, and work out what it could potentially mash into in terms of pop culture and geeky sort of things that people might find accessible and entertaining to listen to. And then we use that to plan and combine together our really daft question. We then read up on it, not too much, but enough so that we feel we've got the bones of the thing. We record it, we edit it, and we publish it, and we share it with the world, literally the world. The episodes kind of have a pretty consistent framework that we've arrived at by now. We started with introductions. The introduction for me, you've already heard. We then pose our really silly question. And then in the show, we break that question apart. So we start off by talking about the pop culture. So this could be, for example, oh God, I can't think of a pop culture thing right now. It could be Captain Scarlet. It could be Captain Scarlet. We'll first talk about, Captain Scarlet, perhaps Super Mario Nation. It's an opportunity for us to kind of break the ice, talk about something that we're confident about and know and love and are passionate about, to start and kind of get ourselves into our swing. And then once we've hit a good groove with that and we've covered kind of the basics, the frame, the bones of the thing, we'll then start talking about the pedagogy and isolation. So what it is, what perhaps the key characteristics are, how it links in with other pedagogies, perhaps what some of the key bits of research are, or the kind of the contemporary discussions around it. With those two individual components discussed, what we'll then do is we'll look to answer our question. So we'll look to frame our pedagogy through our pop culture. Literally, how does X work through Y? It's often quite an elegant procedure. We'll kind of really smash them into each other. In fact, if anything, the more janky it is, the more entertaining usually. But by the end of it, we'll usually get an answer, even if the answer is it doesn't work very well. We'll then summarize our answer, i.e. take what's usually been 10 to 20 minutes of discussion and try and roll it back into something that's actually vaguely intelligible. And we'll summarize that. And then ultimately, take what we've learned and what we've discussed and see what tips there are for people's practice that we can pull out of it. And then we have an outro, which is always a bit of a shaggy dog story. One of the recent examples, actually, I say recent, this one's probably about 2 years old now, is How Do Spooky Muppets? Guide Scrooge Through Transformative Learning. Spooky Muppets, of course, being the Muppets Christmas Carol. We opened the episode with talking about Muppets Christmas Carol and the Muppets in general. It's a subject that's very close to my heart. I absolutely love that movie. I've watched it every single year for Christmas ever since I met my wife. I've looked at all of the back production stuff and read into the history of the Muppets. Love it. So it gets us going. And then we start talking about the basics of Mesro's transformative learning. It being kind of an andragogy, which is something I'm going to absolutely butcher because I know there's some debate over whether andragogy even exists or if it's all just pedagogy. But anyway, we talk about the characteristics of that, and then we look to bring those two separate things together by answering our question of how do Spooky Muppets guide Scrooge through his transformative learning experience, which, to summarize here, was a triumvirate of spirits conspire to instigate a transformative learning experience. They confront him with a disorienting dilemma of ghostly goings-on, the impact of his actions, the threat of his mortality and damnation. And shaken by this disorienting dilemma, Scrooge is guided in forming new schema and understandings around Christmas, generosity and community, and then sets out to act on them on Christmas morning. And then our Spooky Muppets' place in this is that they act essentially as facilitators and metacognitive nudgers, kind of helping him along the critical reflection process. Scrooge himself is an active participant in this, which is, as you may be aware, quite critical in transformative learning, and engages willingly in reflective and critical practice to enable it. And then we get some wonderful tips out of that, which were, in this particular case, the importance of students actually having and being aware of their metacognitive toolkit to be able to engage with their own learning as a journey, to understand the intrinsic learning events required and the motivation they need to connect with, and ultimately the case for transparent pedagogy and just making people aware of where they sit kind of in that story of their learning. We've got a few principles as we do it, so we try and make the episodes, we try and have a bit of fun with it. We try and be playful, kind of a safe space where it's okay to screw up, and because we do that, it's also editable. We understand that we can and will edit things, and that's been really relevant when we've got guests on who are sometimes a little bit nervous. I'm actually a little bit nervous now. I'm not normally used to talking live. I'm normally sitting there much more happily, ready to cut out all of the bits that I get a little bit wrong. Anyway, it's also conversational, so we try and slip into a nice natural flow early, and we've definitely gotten better at that over the years, not just between ourselves, but also making our guests feel more comfortable so that it can be a nice back and forth rather than something that feels overly scripted. It's inclusive. We try and make it as accessible to people as possible. We're conscious actually recently that a lot of our pop culture references have been very much couched in Western culture, for example, and we're trying to expand out of that and get some people to help us with that. We try to make it educational as well, so we're trying to make something that we can learn from as part of the process, but also that hopefully people can take things away themselves that they can use in their practice. And it's fun, we try and have a laugh with it. It's not something we get paid for. It's something that happens. A tiny amount of it goes into my professional CPD time, and the rest of it happens in my own time. So it does actually have to be something that we can enjoy doing enough to do in our own time. And occasionally it gets a little bit sweary because we're off the clock, and it's sometimes a good place to vent the spleen and just kind of be explicit and unedited. Can't speak. Friday afternoon. So why did it start? I said I was going to allude to this earlier. Well, basically, the project started because I'd started a new role as a learning designer. I'd started a new role as a learning designer at the Open University, and I was overcome with absolutely dreadful imposter syndrome, which several years later I now recognise as essentially an occupational hazard of working in higher education, and particularly working in learning design roles. And in particular, I felt that I was very well based. I felt I had a very good knowledge base and kind of practical experience base in media production, but less so in pedagogy. Quite a good instinctive feel for teaching and coaching and training, but not the kind of the taxonomy to talk about pedagogies with people, or to be able to necessarily recognise them when they jumped up and bit me. around this time, I was also starting out with podcasting. Well, I should say restarting out with podcasting. I've been doing things in that space for a while and a lot of media production outside of work for a while, but I was really getting my teeth into to podcasting and the big podcasting boom of the 2015s. Um, and yeah, with all of these in mind, I decided that the way I was going to teach myself about pedagogy was I was going to sit in a quiet room with a microphone facing a pot plant and then read up on a bit of pedagogy and try to explain it to the pot plant, which would have been an unbelievably dull idea and not in any way worth people listening to. Fortunately, on my way to this, I decided to grab a coffee and ran into one of my colleagues, Dr. Mark Childs, who is a great authority on pedagogy. He's really well read, and he seems to know everybody in higher education. I'll guarantee there's at least somebody in this call who's met him. And he offered to be my pot plant. He offered to sit and talk with me about it and record it. We did. We sat down, we had a chat about it, and it was really wonderful. It's infinitely better to talk about somebody else, even better to talk with somebody else about it who actually knew what they were talking about. And it progressed from there and developed. We eventually binned that recording because it was utterly unlistenable, but we had the core of it in the process there. From that point, it evolved. So we recorded a pilot episode from there. We sort of came up with the idea of perhaps understanding these pedagogies through pop culture. And I think the first one actually was understanding communities of practice, the communities of practice model for professional learning through World of Warcraft, which one of Mark's colleagues had written a paper on recently. And we talked through it and recorded it, and we binned it because it didn't quite work as a thing to listen to, as a really useful conversation, but we binned it. And then we kind of developed a little bit more towards the question-based format, which we're at today with the really daft questions you saw earlier. From there, we've also grown to pulling guests, initially just from kind of, the cronies and friends and folks that we knew working at the Open University. We had a really rich strata of wonderful people we could pull in. And then as the podcast itself has grown and started to get more international reach and started to be listened to by more people, we've been really lucky to have people on from all across the world. And people from other universities in the UK as well, and just a really wonderful diaspora of people from different professions and places in their professional practice, which has been really lovely. And as we've gone through as well, we've gotten a bit more relaxed with it. We used to try and be really firm with our structure on it and really worry about, is this going to be a good listen? And we've actually sort of started to trust ourselves and trust the process and trust the editor a lot more. And subsequently, I think it comes across as a much more listenable, relatable, authentic, and fun and funny show to be a part of, as well as hopefully, still educational. The scale of it's also increased. I mean, this is essentially a small personal development project to address an aspect of imposter syndrome that has gotten wildly out of control and has now started swallowing up an increasing lump of my spare time. But we've got some really, really good things out of it. First of all, just from a professional development perspective, it's given me the fundamentals and the taxonomy in the language and the confidence to talk about pedagogy. I am by no means a seasoned academic. If anybody saw my referencing, you would weep to see my referencing. It's terrible, awful for it. I'm not as widely read as many of my colleagues, but thanks to the conversations I've been able to have with a whole range of experts across the community, I now feel sort of sufficiently armed to at least engage in those conversations and engage from a position of, I don't know much, but this is what I do know, and these are the vague connections. And it's given me a real confidence boost in actually doing that. And that has in turn fed into my professional practice, then as a learning designer, now as a senior learning designer, working with academics and helping them to design and craft their modules. It's also sort of inducted me into the wider conversation and the language of the higher education sector, kind of what the ongoing controversies and discussions are, and yeah, just be able to feel like I'm much more part of that. I've also feel like I found my voice, my kind of professional voice, by doing it. As you can probably tell, I'm much more used to editing out my pauses and hiccups and blunders here, and perhaps redoing things. But I think the practice that I've gained through doing podcasting, both through this and my other projects, I think has actually made me a better speaker at not just these kinds of things, but also I do a lot of facilitation and workshops and things. I feel I now have a voice both in my sort of primary place of work, but also within the community. I can do things that go out into the community, people listen, and then they talk to me about it, which is really lovely. It's also helped me bring more of my authentic self into my professional work. Barbara, talking earlier about being able to utilize and leverage your strengths as a learner. It's exactly where I subsequently realized several years down the line why this had worked for me, was that it was able to draw some bits of myself that I was good at and use them to attack an area of deficit, attack an area of potential growth, to flip the narrative on that one. And yeah, bring more of my authentic self into it and actually be more of myself at work, and not feel like I perhaps needed to slap a professional mask on to start the day, but could instead just kind of come in and blunder on, and still feel like I was growing. And podcasting's brilliant. I'm a big advocate for podcasting. Everybody should have a podcast. I love it. But outside of my personal kind of professional development side, we've had some really good impact as well. It's been a door to an international community of practice for us, as I said. It's also resulted in some really wonderful collaborations with people across the world. We've worked with people in Japan, in Canada. We've done some journal papers, one of which is in the Journal of Adult Play, and the other of which is in the Journal of Digital Culture and Education, which a better prepared person, an academically minded person, would have linked here, but I'll put links if anybody's interested into the chat at the end. We've also done several conference pieces and activities. This photo here was from the Playful Learning Conference this year. We can see we very optimistically made a banner to demark our little podcasting area. And if you look very, very carefully, you might just see the tear, where in our fury, in our frenzy to get it up and get our territory marks off, we managed to tear it. We're also working on an upcoming book, which is something I never thought I'd do. We're taking the themes of our episodes essentially as a first draft, and then developing them more in a book, so that other people who come after us, who find themselves in my position of working in education and perhaps feeling like a bit of an imposter and a bit underarmed in the language and the connections of it, can hopefully have a relatable primer and have a slightly better start than I did. And we've got listeners. We've got listeners around the world, which is crazy to me. People sometimes say like, "Oh, you're Mike from Pedagodzilla," and they know that, and it's strange, but really lovely. We've also learned about the things that you could do with this with student activities. So I've advised module teams before on how they might structure activities, sort of particularly collaborative, creative, and podcasting activities for student use. And actually, having gone through it ourselves, we've come out of it with some really useful things, such as just an understanding of what it's like from the student perspective, i.e., the huge amount of time it takes to make even just a small thing. Understanding of the collaborative, communicative nature of the activity. Understanding how it fits in with the social construction of understanding. I mean, Karen, your thing earlier on how we build that understanding between us in conversation, I couldn't agree with you more. That was something that, again, this project has armed me with, is the language to understand that. The importance of liberating structures, so the fact that we've developed a framework and how that actually frees us. So freedom within the framework, liberating structures, two of my favorite taglines, have made this all possible, and are kind of like my top tip for people doing this, both for student activities and for ourselves. And understanding the accessibility of this kind of technology and this kind of activity for students, particularly at the Open University. So I'm going to boil all that down to just a few quick top tips. First, for podcasting, if you're interested in looking at podcasting yourself. Next, for professional development. And then finally, for if you'd like to do this kind of thing with students. So for podcasting, it's got a very low barrier of entry. Anybody who thinks that, oh, this isn't for me, you need fancy gear and software, even the most basic microphone on your phone is often good enough to start a podcast with. A lot of the software that you might need is free, and there are now free platforms to publish your podcast on. The headsets that you get given for work, for sort of Teams meetings and things, can also suit as well, just to get yourself started. Also, frameworks your friends. Develop an episode framework, and don't be afraid to test it, record it, do a few iterations, and bin those until you get a framework that you're happy with, that you feel that you can stretch within. Plan not to overplan. So I mentioned earlier, reading up on things, but not over preparing. I think there's nothing worse sometimes than hearing a very overly scripted podcast where people read off a thing and then you say your bit and you say your bit. I think the best podcasts are conversations and discussions, and the best ones of those are where the understanding is developing naturally between the speakers and participants. And if worse comes to worse, remember that post-production can fix most sins. If you accidentally do slag off the Vice Chancellor during your thing, or perhaps reveal some of your organizational dirty laundry, just make a note of it and then you can snip it out at the other end. And if you do want to spend a little bit of money on it, then you'd be amazed how far a cheap microphone and a pop filter can go in making you sound wonderful and professional. When considering this kind of activity professional development, I'd actually widen it to any sort of creative activity and linking that to your professional development. So I'd say just find ways to engage your professional practice through that lens of your authentic self. And that could be your creativity. It could be other hobbies. You could be incredibly into Subbuteo. The important thing with it, though, is to find collaborators and co-conspirators who you can engage with that with and have a conversation around it. Again, Karen, it's yes, I totally agree. It's being able to just have those conversations about your field of practice. For me, it's been finding a sort of a fun, accessible way that relates to things I like to do and creating things. But for other people, even just, knocking around tiny plastic players with a football while, for example, talking about the zone of proximal development could be a way for them to just engage those different parts of their brain and separate themselves a little bit from the day-to-day context. And finally, dance like there's nobody watching. We didn't start this podcast. I didn't start this podcast with an intention of building up an international listenership, but it happened anyway. I'd still be doing it even if there was nobody listening, because ultimately it's about the process and it's about doing the thing and the sort of satisfaction of having done it. That's what makes it really important. And I'm very nearly finished. I'm conscious I'm coming up to my 20-minute mark. And then for students, I'd suggest this is a wonderful candidate for problem-based learning structures if you're looking to do an activity thread around this. Although if you are doing that, I'd suggest starting with a technology and software baseline and to really put a structure in place for your collaboration, team formation, and roles. Those are sort of from our experience of collaborative activities, particularly via distance, the Open University. Those are the big hurdles for students, and those are often the ones that can be the things that switch them off the most. We know that students hate collaboration, but that they get a lot from it. So this is just smoothing out the bumpy bits in that. Make sure they've got a really clear objective, a loose framework to work within, and then let them have it. But do also consider that you will need an accessible and inclusive alternative for those students who may be unable to participate for whatever reason. And so, it's as a project, I've gotten a huge amount from it. I think that our listeners have as well. Well, probably less than us, but hopefully they're enjoying it. And it's something that I'm looking forward to continuing. I'm really looking forward to being able to share the book with people at the end of the year. I'm illustrating and paginating it as well as writing a few chapters. We're looking forward to showing everybody. And lastly, I'd just like to throw in a call to action. Do you yourselves, as edu professionals, have a pedagogic soapbox upon which you like to stand that you're super passionate about? Could be a pedagogy or a theory or just an aspect of practice that you're like, this is my jam. I'm so passionate about this and let me tell you about it. Or alternatively, do you have an area of pedagogy or practice you struggle with? We had somebody contact us who really wanted us to do an episode on ontology and epistemology because they'd never been able to make it clear in their head, and they found that really useful. Or alternatively, do you have basically a full episode ready in your head? Do you have a really daft pedagogic and pop culture question up your sleeve that you'd like to record with us? Either way, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Always looking to bring new voices onto the show. And thanks very much for the opportunity to talk here. I'll de-share my slides just now, but where to find us is up on the screen. I'll pop these into the chat as well.